Hello. In this video, I'm going to help you out with figuring out where do I even start to prepare for the ACT, what order should I go through all this, and how do I balance watching videos, reading books on the concepts, and actually practicing. Because that can be one of the hardest things. It's just getting started because you see this giant book in front of you, or if you're on my channel, you'll see all these videos, and you're just going to be overwhelmed and not know where to start. That's where this video comes in. So if you find it helpful, leave a like, subscribe to help me out, and leave a comment with things you like about the videos, things you want to see more of, if there's any particular concept that you'd like me to maybe make a video with further explanation. But let's jump right into it. Step 1. Before you ever do anything with the ACT, develop a rough college list of where you might want to apply. You don't have to know exactly where you're going, but there's a few things that you should try to know. So for each school, go online and figure out the following things. What's their typical ACT score range? You can just Google that and it'll give you a range of typically what scores their applicants have, or at least those they accept, their current students. This is what's going to tell you what score range you actually want to target. You might be fine with a lower score if the schools you're interested in typically have lower scores. If you're trying to get to some higher end ones, you need to know how high do I need to get, because you don't need to go for higher than is really necessary. It can be helpful, but you also need to know if you're not where you want to be. So having that target is critical. Also, figure out, do they super score the ACT? If you don't know what super scoring is, that's where if you take the test multiple times, your composite score, which is just an average of all four sections scores, so the English, the math, the reading, and the science, it'll average all their scores. Super scoring is where they just take the best from each section across all the tests that you took and that you submitted to that college. So that's where it's really helpful to take the test multiple times, so that way you can combine them to get a really good composite score without having to do really well on all of them all in one test. Almost all places now do super score the ACT, but if a school you're interested in doesn't, it's important to know that. Also figure out if the writing section is required. The writing section is optional on the ACT. It is extremely rare that a school will require it, so if they don't bother, it's pointless. But if they do, it's important to know that ahead of time so you can prepare for it and make sure you register for the writing version of the ACT. So don't take it if you don't have to. These are all going to determine your goals and how you are going to prepare. If they do super score, which is why we want to know this, then you can actually start taking the test before you fully master all the sections. So if you have 2 or 3 of them where you're typically doing pretty well, you can go ahead and start registering if you're okay with that. It's a big time investment, not fun, but it can be very helpful because then you can start locking in some of those high section scores and you don't have to worry about that section anymore. And sometimes it takes a few tries because a little bit of luck to get that score that you want. If you start early, you can get more chances at the bat to get that score. If, however, they don't super score, you'd want to know that, and you'd want to actually try and make sure that you really can consistently do well on all 4 sections, taking the entire test at one time before you start registering, because otherwise you're not going to get the scores you want, at least for that school. So once you have your college list and you know all this, what do we do next? Just stop and think if you're interested in engineering for when you do apply to college. There's obviously no commitment at this stage. You don't have to know for sure. But if it's something that you do think you might be interested in, you want to know that because that will affect what target score you're going to go for. Because if you do plan on applying for engineering, you're going to want to aim for a strong math and science score because they're going to care more about those 2 sections than any others. If you're not interested in engineering, all that's going to matter is your composite score, which is just the average of all 4. So it doesn't really matter if you're bad at math and science if you're really good at English and reading, because then you can have some sections that are good and some that are weak, and they'll balance out to get the score you need. But if you do need engineering, math and science become a much higher priority than for anyone else. Step 3, take a practice ACT. I do mention this is optional, so it's kind of up to you. I generally recommend it, but find and take a practice ACT and score it. This will just give you a starting point, let you know this is where my score is right now. so I can know how much further do I have to get ahead? What are my problems? Do I not know the material that's being tested? Am I having pacing issues? That sort of a thing. Probably not going to do too great on this one. That's fine. And when you do this, you can either break it up by section. You can just do the entire English, take a break, do the math, take a break, do a reading, take a break, do the science. Or you can take it all at once and get a true baseline that way. But I know a lot of people don't have the time for that because it's a long test. That's okay, because this is just to get a rough idea of where you start out. It'll also help you track your progress, because as you start seeing improvement, you won't know you're improving if you don't know where you started. It can be frustrating if you do a lot of studying and then come in and take a test and then you have a score that's lower than you think. But if you had started out and taken a practice test to realize that actually I had started out 4 or 5 points lower than that, you could actually be happy with seeing you've made progress and just have a little further to go. And then once you have all that figured out, now is where you're actually going to start your studying and practice. That's what the rest of this video is going to cover, is how do I do that. So we're going to focus on one section or two at a time. When I say section, I mean English, math, reading, or science. Don't try and tackle the whole test all at the same time. That might work for some people, but in general, you're going to be taking on too much all at once and bouncing between them. And so what's going to happen is you're going to learn something for one section, but then you're going to go do the other three, and by the time you get back to that section, you're going to forget whatever you just learned and lose that progress. And it's just going to slow you down overall. So instead, pick one or two and focus on those until you've made some decent progress. Then you can move on and you can come back later, but do at least several in a row. Dedicate a couple days or weeks to a section or two and see what that progress can get to. If you do get frustrated with a particular section, or if you get too bored with it, none of it's fun, but sometimes you just get sick of saying the same thing over and over again. You don't want to feel like you're beating your head against the wall, because sometimes you're going to see also your progress is going to improve and then you're going to hit kind of a wall where it stops improving. That often happens. You just have to keep pushing through it, try and figure out what's giving you trouble, and eventually it'll keep moving forward. But if that happens and you find yourself getting frustrated, if you're angry and can't think straight, you're not going to improve very well. It's time to just go to a new section, work over there for a bit, and then you can come back. As you have made progress on a section and you've moved on to another, do return to that first one. Every now and then, do a passage or two, or maybe just one section once a week, and just maintain the progress you made so you don't forget everything you just figured out. Or if you're going to be able to super score, you can even start registering, and if you can lock that section in as getting officially a good score, you don't have to worry about it again. And then after you've gone through each of these sections, you can work your way up to doing multiple sections in a row, and then eventually the whole test all in one sitting during your practice. When you do this all in a row, make sure that you practice them in the same order they appear on the test. So if I'm going to practice English and math, I'm going to do English first and then math. I'm not going to do math first, because math doesn't come before English. The reason it matters is the fatigue factor. When you go and take the actual test, English will always be first. So you're always going to be fresh and alert for that one. Science will always be last. So you're going to be pretty tired by the time you get there. So you need to practice pushing through that exhaustion. You're not always going to be fresh. Whereas for English, you're never going to be exhausted. You might still be waking up because it's early in the day, but you're not going to be exhausted from 2 hours of testing. So you don't need to practice going through English with that kind of mental fatigue. So what section should I go to first? How should I work my way through it? Everybody's different, but this is going to be my recommended order based on what I've seen, what's happened with my students, and what's usually worked for most. Everyone is different. I would like to state that again. So something else might work better for you. Feel free to switch it up. But I typically recommend doing English first for various reasons. First of all, it's the most consistent and straightforward of all the sections. So what you see is typically what you get with the English section. There's fewer tricks from the test. There's not going to be a lot of trap answers, trick questions. They're not trying to trick you most of the time. They might accidentally have something that's a little harder than they realized, but for the most part, they're just going to be testing, do you know the material? There's going to be fewer pacing issues. It might be harder at first, but for the most part, after you know the material, pacing is not typically a problem for English, unlike all the other sections. It also has the most forgiving scoring scale, because again, to score this, it's all scored on a curve, so that scale changes from test to test, but there's 75 questions in the English. It has the most, which means missing a few questions here and there isn't that big of a deal, and it's less likely to knock your score down. Whereas something like reading or science, missing one might knock your score down one right off the bat, or it might jump it down a whole 2 points because you missed one question. So English is much more forgiving, which helps it be more consistent as well. And as I said earlier, it's just testing, do you know your punctuation and grammar rules? Nothing tricky about it, just do you know it? So if you do understand the rules, which can take a while because most people don't when they first come in, but once you do, you can do well in the section. There's no reason that you can't do well on English unless you still have some issues with pacing, and everybody is different, but generally, once you know these rules and understand them, you can do well on English. Not only that, but you're not normally trying to fix accuracy and pacing separately. Here, if you learn your rules, typically you're able to go faster and the pacing kind of fixes itself. So you can kind of knock both of those out at once. And because of all this, it generally is going to show the fastest rate of improvement from all the sections. Again, everyone is different, but this has always been what we target first, or at least try to with all of my students. And usually that's the one that we're going to be able to get up to a pretty high score much more quickly than the others. If anyone's just cramming to see, can I improve my score in a month to take this next test? I don't generally recommend it, but if you do end up in that situation, we would always just focus on English and not much of the others, because that's the one where that's more doable. And another nice thing is because most people don't really know these punctuation and grammar rules when they come in, they often start with a low score, so there's lots of room to improve. Combine that with the fastest to improve and the most consistent, you can see a pretty huge jump in your overall score by focusing on English first. In fact, this is typically the section where we'll typically go for that higher score that helps pull up the average. So that way you don't really have to become super great at whatever your weakest section is. It's usually English that's pulling that other section up. Not for everybody. For some people that is the English. But for most, this is the section that can do that for you. And that's what I just said. I just forgot to click. So after English, where do you go? That's typically going to be reading or science. It doesn't really matter, just whichever you prefer. If you're looking at engineering, I'd probably say science more than reading, but otherwise they're very similar in what their challenges are and what you have to do. Because both of them don't have much tested material to study. It's not like English where you can go study your punctuation rules or your grammar rules. It's not like math where you can go learn all your math concepts. Instead, they're really going to rely more on practice and experience, figuring out how do I handle this section? How do I get the pacing under control? What really are they asking? How do these questions work? So that just takes practice. So you have to learn how to approach each section and master that pacing. It could take a while for your score to improve. It's often going to be a pretty slow or relatively steady and staying about the same for a little bit until things start to click, and then it'll often kind of jump up for a bit. And it might start improving more steadily from there once you're more comfortable with the section. Or it might even plateau and do more of like a stepwise jump, plateau, jump, plateau. So just be aware that's how these sections tend to work. Also know that the scoring scales for these two sections, because there's fewer questions, are highly variable and they are the least forgiving. So expect your scores to be less consistent. So your score is going to jump up and down just depending on the test because of this scoring scale itself, which that can also be an advantage because getting one or two more right, even if they're just lucky guesses, can jump your score up 1, 2, or even 3 points potentially, which isn't really true for math or English. Then after reading or science will be whichever one of reading or science you didn't do. So we're going to knock out both of those after English. And that leaves me with math as the last one. And that's because there's a lot of material that can be tested for math. And on top of all that material trying to learn, pacing is also a challenge. So it's both things that are causing issues. So because of that, the improvement tends to be more steady because you can just keep learning the math concepts, but it's typically much slower than the other sections overall. Again, everyone's different, but it's usually the slowest one to see improvement. However, if you are interested in engineering, like I said, math and science are more important than other sections. So I would consider mixing this section in after English. Then you can hit maybe English, then math and science, and then finally reading. It's kind of up to you, but you're going to want to start seeing that improvement a little bit earlier on so you have time for that math to get up there, because often this is the section that English is pulling up for people. Or it might be either reading or science if they can't get that pacing under control. So now, the rest of this video is going to go section by section and talk about how we want to approach each section and study for it. So before I go into this, I would like to point out that if you don't want to watch this part, you don't really have to. The whole idea is, the first thing for each one is going to be watch the intro and overview video for each section from my YouTube videos. If you want to stick with my channel, you could also go elsewhere if you want, but if you watch that intro, they'll give you all the information I'm about to for each individual section. But if you want to see all of it put together to give you a kind of a roadmap for the entire test, then you can stick with me in this video. But I wanted to put that out there so I can save you some time if you didn't want to sit through the rest of this. But English, let's get into it. As I said, watch that intro and overview video. That will teach you what to expect, the overall pacing, and strategy. After that, go to my punctuation guide videos. Learn those punctuation rules ASAP, as soon as possible. This is the bulk of what's tested on the English section. So if you get that mastered, your score is going to go way up very quickly. After you have your punctuation rules, then it's time to start actually taking the practice tests. I typically don't recommend you start taking a bunch of practice tests until you have the punctuation down, because you want to know the main thing being tested first so you can start applying it and practice using that in the test. And then you can kind of balance between taking practice tests so you can apply what you've learned, and then going back and also watching the other concept videos that I have for English and kind of go back and forth that way so you can learn some stuff from the concept videos, get some practice applying it and dealing with it in an ACT setting, go back and learn a little bit more and keep going back and forth. So focus on learning the concepts more so than the pacing, because usually the pacing is going to resolve itself as you learn the material. Not for everyone, but don't worry about the pacing as much at first. Don't just take forever, still try to do it on time, but don't panic. It'll probably get itself down for you. Just make sure you're answering questions based on the rules as you learn them. You're going to often start out with this sounds right because you don't know the rules, but as you learn the rules, move away from that because that's going to lead you astray. And I would like to point out I've got some advanced concept videos. They're not critical. So you don't necessarily have to watch those to get a good score. They can help push your score to those upper limits. But feel free to move on to other sections before you get to those. And you'll probably already have a decent English score. So after English, let's say we go to reading. Watch the intro, strategy, and pacing videos. There's only 3 of them, because as I said before, there's not a bunch of stuff to study. It's going to be more about experience and learning how to approach and handle the section. So they're going to give you that guidance on how to do that. Then practice, practice, practice. It's all about experience for reading. Pacing is critical. This is one of the hardest parts of the ACT is just finishing the reading comprehension section in time. So always time yourself and work to get your timing under control. Learn to identify the trap answers, because if all the sections, this is the one that's going to have traps to try and trick you. My videos will point out exactly what those look like, and if you watch my walkthrough of example passages, I'll point them out as well so you can learn to see what they are and you won't fall for them. So that's reading. How about science? Very similar to reading in that there's not a lot of stuff to study. So you're going to watch the intro and this time graph and special answer type videos. Those 2 will give you all of the critical information. At that point, you can start taking your practice tests. Once you have an idea of how the section works and are getting a little more comfortable, then you can go back and watch my science concept videos 1 and 2. Those cover some of the concepts that often show up. They're not nearly as important as the graph stuff and the main concepts or strategy, because really they're testing primarily can you read the graphs and tables, but there are a few concepts that show up from time to time or that can really help you to be able to figure out what's happening in those graphs. That's what these 1 and 2 videos do. I do have a science concept video 3 that just covers some concepts that are much more rarely tested. You do see them from time to time, so I did want to put them out there for you, but that's optional. It's not critical. You can come back to this after other sections. It's probably the least important video on my channel. Now, do note pacing is important here too, just like with the reading. So do time yourself and work to get your pacing under control. Once your scores start reaching their target, you want to practice the science section while fatigued. I wanted to put this one in here because it's very unique to the science section. This is also covered in that intro video on how to do that, give you some ideas, but the science section is the last one. So if you're doing well, doing just the science, it's not uncommon that when you go and take the actual test, your science score plummets, or at least drops. Everyone's affected differently, because you're just tired and you start making silly mistakes. So you're going to want to practice taking the science section while fatigued. Again, my intro video will cover how to do that and give you some ideas. Finally, we're at math. So again, watch the intro and strategy video. The thing here is it's going to give you a lot of focusing on tricks. How can you get that answer without knowing all the math? Because otherwise, your only option is to try and learn all of the math, which is a lot. But there are a few tricks that can be used a lot more than you think to get your answer without knowing the math. If you can master when you can use those and how to use those, you can start answering a lot of questions you wouldn't have been able to otherwise, or you might be able to do it more quickly than by doing the math properly, which can help with the pacing. So figure out what those strategies are as soon as you can and start practicing when can I use them. Then you want to balance taking practice tests and learning the concepts. Kind of like English after the punctuation, go back and forth between actually taking practice tests and watching the concept videos. If you're watching this as I'm putting it out, I'm working on the math concept videos as we go. So stick with me, they'll show up, or you can always get some videos elsewhere or get some practice books, but make sure that you're going back and forth between studying the concepts from somewhere and actually getting practice tests itself. So you can work on the pacing and applying it and seeing how they are asked on the ACT. Focus on the earlier concepts first. When I say earlier, I mean the stuff you see earlier in the math section, because it gets harder as you go along. And then, as you get the earlier stuff, then you can move on to the more advanced things that appear later on in the math section. Pacing is going to be important here, but focus more on accuracy for that first 2/3, which would be the first 40 questions, because those tend to be more consistent than the last 20, and you can actually get a pretty good score without having to do well on that last third. So if you can do well on the first 40, which is easier to do than the last 20, then you set yourself up pretty well. And again, really try to master when you can use those alternative approaches that are covered in the intro video, because that's what's going to help you be more consistent across all the tests, because you don't know what's going to be tested. So that way you're more flexible to handle the harder stuff that you don't know how to do. And it'll help your score increase more quickly because you're going to be able to answer questions that you wouldn't have otherwise known how to answer. And that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully now you have an idea of where to start and what order to work your way through things. If you found it helpful, leave a like, subscribe, and good luck on your studying.